Cori Crider, Aurélien Mähl, Alissa Cooper. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We will be discussing today a digital market, which plays a pivotal role in the evolution of the digital economy, namely search, and more specifically, a horizontal search market. And we all know that it has been very systemically constrained and tipped. And there are yet attempts to reopen something which appears to be um, closed, closed territory. And I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to exchange our views about the state of affairs in this market and about some possible regulatory remedies or any other remedies which could, or judicial remedies indeed, which could somehow inject more competition in such pivotal digital market. So maybe I'll invite you, Oriel, because you represent DuckDuckGo and you are one of the few direct competitors of the current monopolist or kind of uh, dominant
Gatekeeper.
company in the market. To begin with answering these questions and invite both our fantastic experts to add and to continue on this on these points. So my first question is obviously Europe-centered, and it's related to the Digital Markets Act. So many expectations have been injected into this new regime from day one. So what is your assessment as a business user, as a competitor, as a newcomer into this business, horizontal newcomer? How do you see the dynamic of the DMA? Are you satisfied?
Yeah, thank you, Aless. And I want to start with what's good with the DMA. And what's good with the DMA is that it addresses these two dimensions, of what led to the sort of Google's monopoly. That is, on the one hand, distribution, and that is controlling basically the access points via default placement. And on the other hand, scale or supply. And that's basically Google's data advantage that they built by leveraging this distribution advantage. And the DMA addresses both with, on the one hand, choice screens, so to get users to pick their preferred default, and on the other hand, provisions to sort of remove friction to switching. And then on the supply side, there's an obligation for Google, the only search gatekeeper in the DMA, to share click and query data, so data on the relevance of search results. And when talking about our specific experience with this, I would say that there have been areas where there has been more scrutiny, and even sometimes up to an investigation where we saw tangible impact. For instance, there has been a choice screen to pick your search default on Chrome, which ended up being relatively well designed with lots of attention from the Commission. And this triggered about 75% increase in the queries that we have on Chrome, following the rollout. And also on iOS, there's been an investigation which led to a choice screen that now is also, I think, pretty satisfactory. And that's obviously a pretty important change of approach in terms of the status quo before, because for so many years, search engines or browsers were picked for the users, not by them. And it was a situation where just so many did not realize that the search engine and the browser were two different things. But I would also say that there's also obviously a lot of untapped potential with the DMA. And that's the purpose of a letter we recently signed with other search engines, with the consumer group BEUC and other civil society partners, to say that there is still frustration with the DMA, which in our view is mostly due to obstruction from the gatekeepers, from Google. And an example that unfortunately I like to give is that if you try to switch your search default on Chrome using an extension, you will still see a big change back to Google pop-up that shows, after you do this change, which, as far as we are concerned, cost us about 50% of our user base, and which is obviously an illegal dark pattern. And then I mentioned the supply side. Here, there's a proposal from Google that is already on the table, but the proposal eliminates up to 99% of the queries from the data set, so it's not commercially useful. And also another area where there hasn't been much progress so far. And maybe I would, finish with on this point with, a note also on the consistency of the implementation of the compliance. I mentioned iOS earlier, which has recently surfaced the browser TrueScreen again, because the first one was deemed non-compliant, among other reasons, because it was shown to people that did not have Safari as their default. And so far, Google has been left off the hook of doing something similar, despite having had the exact same behavior with the search TrueScreen on Android. So, we think that we are at a stage where we support the Commission making more use of the teeth that the DMA provides when it comes to all these search engine related topics, and reasonably fast if that's possible, because there's what the DMA provides and also what the DMA doesn't. And I think, and I'm happy to talk about this later, the US versus Google case also uncovered a lot of evidence and a lot of the structural issues with the search engine market. And that also reveals that, in a way, the DMA is not comprehensive enough in addressing this dual distribution and scale dimension.
Thank you very much, Aurélien. Cori, please.
So I come at this issue from a different perspective. I don't, like Aurélien, I don't make any competing product, but when I think about the DMA in general, I think about it as somebody who has previously taken cases myself as a sort of litigator against a platform. And I think I really would like to see us not fall into the trap that I think was fallen into with the GDPR, where you had a kind of statute that was incredibly promising in principle, with a lot of power in principle, but which would never had the staffing or rigor to enforce it up to its promise. And as a result, then it never created any kind of general will or consent to go and make it do what it says. And people stopped really believing in the law in some ways. So people could, there's a huge amount of fanfare about the GDPR. We all remember when it passed, and there was this idea that it was going to be an incredible curb on the platform's power and on their exploitation of personal data. And here we all are. And, my understanding, reading the news lately, is that it's just one of those things that potentially now on the chopping block in this so-called kind of deregulatory fervor. There has been, but I want to be clear, there has been a huge amount of negativity recently about the entire Brussels enforcement exercise, and I think that has gone too far. I mean, but the problem, we have to be honest with ourselves, which is that I think Brussels, the entire enforcement apparatus and the legislative apparatus, saw these problems earlier than anyone and named the problems earlier than anyone, and has passed very far-reaching, world first laws many times, but it hasn't yet been quite enough to stop us from an entirely concentrated monopolized ecosystem. So we got to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, is what we are doing working? And if it's not, what is it going to take to make it work? So, I saw a recent quote from one of the enforcers, Lindsay McCallum, saying, well, we really prefer regulatory dialogue with companies over extended compliance litigation. And my reaction to that, as somebody who's sued Facebook and other matters in the past, I'm like, yeah, I get it. Like, I feel you. I suing Facebook is incredibly painful, it's incredibly resource intensive, and it's incredibly time consuming. But there is no way around the fact that some of these early enforcement decisions are going to wind up in court, and they're going to be taken all the way up, because as the old Berkshire Hathaway guy, Charlie Munger, liked to say, show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome, right? They have no incentive to comply early. Every economic incentive is in favor of complying right at the absolute end. So that's just the reality of the world in which we operate. And so my heart slightly breaks when I think about the incredibly well-intentioned civil servants in the Digital Markets Act who are, I heard somebody from Proton say the other day, we had such high hopes, we were really believing in this legislature. And there are just a few, there's a kind of tiny band of people up against the largest and most powerful and deepest pocketed companies the world has at the moment. And so, you know, it's all very well for us all to say, well, do more, do more, do more, but there's only so many of them. So I think there will be a need to sort of shepherd resource, prioritize what's most important in terms of choke points in the digital ecosystem. And yes, be prepared to litigate, right? This is not something that, you know, I hear phrases like self-executing or self-enforcing, and I just smile as a lawyer. I'm like, that's not a thing. Like that's never going to happen. So I think my overall feeling is that it still has a huge amount of promise. I would like to see other things in there that are not currently in there, but basically, if we don't use it and flex it very carefully in the first few years of the regime, I worry that it will go the way of some of these other, you know, some of these other parts of the digital enforcement apparatus and never really fulfill its promise.
Many thanks, Cori. Alissa?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was going to pick up on trying to think of what the right analogy is, and I've been circling around this. Sometimes I think about the GDPR or the Telecommunications Act in the United States. But I think I fully agree with, in particular, Cori's emphasis on the need for really muscular enforcement. On the other hand, some of these monopolies are durable monopolies that have been built over the course of 10, 15, 20 years. So to look back at 1 year and say, oh, it's a failure because we didn't manage to dismantle them all in 1 year, I think we need to imagine that we give it a little bit more time in the way that, you know, the Telecommunications Act, the GDPR, the Sherman Act in the United States, we didn't know their full potential after 1 year. So I still have a lot of optimism to find out what we might be able to do with muscular enforcement of the Digital Markets Act. And it is world leading in a way. The European Commission is trying to do something that hasn't been done in any other jurisdiction. And yeah, more power to the enforcers to carry that out. I think at a high level, along the lines of what Aurélien was talking about, there are a lot of positive signs and there are some concerning signs. And if we broaden out, you know, beyond search, I think we see those glimmers. We see new app stores. We see apps making use of new interoperability features. We see more choice for browsers and search engines. We also see, you know, specification decisions that have already come out from the Commission, which indicate real improvements and changes that are being made, even though they have to be fought for, tooth and nail, bit by bit, for every single improvement against these gatekeepers who, as Cori said, have no incentive really to comply. I think the other positive sign is just that there's a lot of engagement from small businesses that are excited to compete and are realizing the opportunity that the DMA provides. Without that, it definitely, will not be effective. I think some of the more concerning signs, first of all, is just that we're still waiting on the first non-compliance decisions and we don't know what they're going to say. And in particular, I come from more of a technical background. I'm not a lawyer. Very interested in the actual mechanics of compliance and not just the fines. I totally understand the need and the reason for the fines, and it's a sort of natural human tendency to focus on those, in particular during the current geopolitical moment. But I'm going to be much more interested to see what are the measures that are being enforced, and how do we actually measure compliance and non-compliance in a more rigorous way, which I think to date, as Aurélien kind of pointed to, is not exactly happening. It's a bit ad hoc. So I think those things are really ones to watch for. I think the structure of the DMA, in the way it's written and being enforced, it gives too much credence to what the gatekeepers say about how compliance can and cannot be done. I think the data sharing for search is a good example. I think the interoperability for iOS is another good example. The enforcers of this regulation need to be able to call out and check the claims of the gatekeepers in a more substantive way. And so I'm hoping to see more of that in the future.
Thank you very much, Alissa. My second question is somehow complementing the first one, and you have partially answered it. We know that March is a kind of the month where the non-confidential versions of compliance reports are being released to public, and we have opportunity to reflect upon them. So maybe please choose the tone or the mode of your answer. You can go either look at look at technicalities of things, or maybe just reflect upon the overall changing kind of evolving culture of compliance and how the main stakeholders respond to this newly established tradition of the March compliance, how the gatekeepers themselves evolve in terms of how they portray and perceive themselves the correct compliance with the DMA. Aurélien.
Yeah, thanks, Alissa. And I would really follow up on what Alissa just said about using this expertise that is outside of the gatekeepers, so with the business user and with other experts, consumer groups, to sort of scrutinize the gatekeepers. And I think this you can do with actual data. And so, I would say that these compliance reports, they are remarkably light on KPIs. They are more detailed because the commission issued a template that the companies followed, and that's good. But if I read Google's report, it's everything's beautiful under the sun and there's nothing to see here. While actually we know there are issues, and I think that with some KPIs on certain things, it would have been much more apparent. And so, a couple of examples. For instance, if Google would have disclosed how many search engines took up their click and query offer, that would have been a good information to disclose. They don't have to give any names, obviously, just figures. And I would assume that that number might be 0 because that offer is probably commercially useless. And then, on the choice screen issues, you can also use KPIs. It's not about the changes in market share, but rather how rollout has been going. And so, for instance, when it comes to the choice screens, it would have been useful to know, for instance, the percentage of the devices on the market that have seen them. That number should be 100%. And we have, reasons to believe that it's not the case on Android. At least the rollout has been very opaque. And so these sort of things that would have been, I would say, good to know and useful definitely for the public scrutiny. But I would also add a related point is that there's the data that the gatekeepers provide on the public reports, and there's also the data they provide to the participants to their mechanisms, like the choice screens, in terms of performance. And also there, the data we receive has been very, has had a large lag of more than a quarter, and also being very aggregated, and we haven't been really able to measure the impact of anything we've done on our performance on the choice screens because of that.
Many thanks, Aurélien. Cori?
I just want to pick up one of the points he said about increasing the number and range of entities who can participate in these processes a bit, because I'm looking at the DG Comp organogram at the moment, and tell me if this is out of date and the position has been filled. But it looks to me like the chief technology officer is blank. It's a kind of is there one now? Because it looks to me like there isn't one. But more to the point, just kind of again zooming out for a moment, I think one of the things that concerns me about the really scary geopolitical moment in which we find ourselves is that this is obviously being, like you say, well, how are the gatekeepers approaching these reports? And isn't the real answer to the question how they're approaching the reports is that they're going to the White House and whining about the DMA and basically saying, isn't this a tariff on our companies? Isn't it terrible? And can't you make them stop? Right? Even though, in fact, what they're mainly worried about, just to pick up Alyssa's point, I don't think is fines. I think fines are a kind of stalking horse for what everybody is really worried about, which is much more important, which are these structural measures to increase competition, interoperability, to actually open up the choke points, which is, of course, what the DMA is in principle meant to do. And I just hope, to the extent that this is a channel mainly watched by specialists and enforcers, I hope that the enforcers are not, like the tariffs are here now. There's no kind of rolling over and complying simply because the companies have gotten Donald Trump to beat the drum about it. And I was really struck overall by the letter. I mean, Aurélien obviously put one together, but there was another one that came out of the United States, shepherded by Y Combinator, the startup funding ecosystem, and it had tons and tons and tons of American tech companies, AI companies, and other startups, basically saying to Trump, copying the European Commission, everybody says that this is a tariff and is unhelpful and is just some kind of preferential treatment. for Europe because they don't have any great companies of their own, only one European company's in the DMA, but that's false. In fact, we all went and we asked for the Digital Markets Act precisely because of systemic and historic under-enforcement of our own antitrust laws for a very long time. So, you know, it may well be that some other part of regulation has gone too far, but understand that this helps us innovate and helps us compete. So even in the scary geopolitical moment, I would just observe that it's not so simple as to say this is a US-EU split. You know, I live in Europe as an American, and it grieves me to see the way that this is going. But actually, it's a handful of companies who are lining up behind what I would describe as a kind of mafia-style boss, to be honest, and are seeking to use that relationship to undermine this enforcement. So again, I don't, at the risk of seeming to dodge your question, I almost don't know if it matters what they put in the compliance reports, because their main play on the board at the moment is to go over to the United States and to try to get the entire might of the United States behind failure to comply. And Europe has to see that for what it is. And in my view, I hope they can kind of steel themselves to enforce regardless.
Thank you, Cori. Alissa.
Yeah, I think as Aurélien was speaking, my mind went to what might be kind of an oddball place, but it actually dovetails very nicely with what Cori was saying. So if the compliance reports don't really tell us that much about how compliance is actually going, what would tell us is if we had actual data that could form the basis for empirical analysis of what's happening in these markets as a result of this regulatory intervention. And there's, you know, some forms of that data that were mentioned previously, but there's all kinds of data sets that, if they were made available to independent experts, would allow for, you know, true analysis and understanding of what's going on beyond just how the gatekeepers want to cast what is going on. What I've heard, if we think about the provision in the Digital Services Act, Article 40, that is created to allow independent experts to access data from many of these same platforms that are designated as gatekeepers under the DMA. I've heard people been told that data requests under Article 40 for the purposes of analyzing the impact of the DMA or the impact of concentration in these markets won't qualify, because those are not considered systemic risks in the European Union. Now, if you think that corporate concentration of power over search and social networking and app stores and all of these platforms is, you know, not close enough to being a threat to the fundamental rights of the citizens of the European Union, you are not paying attention to what is going on in the world today. So I would really advocate that that we, you know, develop more of a groundswell around this notion that we need independent experts to be able to hold these companies accountable for what they're claiming. And one way to do that is the provision of data access. And it actually exists in European law now because of the Digital Services Act.
Many thanks, Alissa. My next question is related to the mechanics of things. We know that the enforcers have received with the DMA from the co-legislators quite generous discretionary mandate, extending their traditional competences from just responding to ad hoc instances of infringement of ex post competition or antitrust rules towards something more you know, proactive, perhaps, at least according to some commentators or interpreters of the DMA. And if this is the case, how would you help the enforcers to tailor competition in the market of horizontal search? How to make it less monopolistic? How to inject greater dynamism, greater entrance, new entrants or mavericks from different jurisdictions, leaving aside the geography, so to say? What is the recipe? What are the main components? Aurélien.
Should I go first? Yeah. Yeah, you know, I will come back to this feedback loop concept that I mentioned earlier, and the fact that essentially interventions can't just be light interventions, because this isn't going to be enough to address the decade of abusive or illegal behavior, but rather ambitious interventions. And you know, I think that the trial in the US has laid out a lot of evidence in support of this approach. And the idea is, again, addressing this dual distribution and scale advantage with, Google's scale advantage fueling a feedback loop of different network effects that ensure a sort of perpetual scale and quality deficit for rivals. And this, I'm quoting the trial, that really locks in this advantage for Google. And so the idea really that we have in mind is that there's a need to jumpstart remedies, to really be, I would say, ambitious and fast about them. And that includes both things that enable competitors to reach consumers, how they find us on the shelf, and that's the choice screens that we already mentioned. And then there's also removing friction to switching, which the DMA addresses pretty well in theory. But it also means, in our view, that Google should have to work with competitors by licensing their search infrastructure under fair terms, so that competitors can really build and innovate off this infrastructure, and in order really to create contestability. And so that's a structural problem in the market. It's not just about an illegal behavior. And what I mean by this is that it has its place in the regulation of the DMA to create contestability, and in our view should be considered for the review of the regulation next year.
If I may, a follow-up question, please. There are two dimensions where DuckDuckGo was particularly vocal, namely the increased visibility, choice screen, greater, more intuitive and more workable choice screen, and B, the technical side, accessing data where you basically said that 99% of all this stuff is useless. So it's like entering long password somewhere in a coffee shop where you can change with, you can mistake with one digit and everything, it doesn't work. So I imagine intuitively, it's quite easy to provide you with bulk of data, which would be rather meaningless. Do you see a mechanic, a kind of a logical workable solution to this? How would you expect, how would you force the data being accurate and workable from you, particularly given that the DMA, unlike the UK equivalent, doesn't have this final offer mechanism where you can somehow assign independent arbitrator to decide which price is fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory?
Yeah, and what you're mentioning is also something that should be considered for the DMA, because the DMA mentions several times fair term, like front access to this or that, and at the same time, it's known that it's a pretty disputed concept in field. We think that when it comes to friend terms for that obligation on sharing click and query data, there is an argument to say that it should probably be done at marginal cost, because that's the only way that you can ensure contestability. But I would agree that there needs to be probably a sort of mechanism in the DMA to address the unavoidable disputes around what this concept means. So that's on the pricing dimension. And then we also have views obviously on which the fact that this data set, most of the different modules, the data on the different modules, not just the 10 blue links, should be part of the package. And then finally, there's the issue of anonymization, which is obviously very important. And that's what I mean when I say that 99% of the data set is removed, is the Google's way to abuse this anonymization safeguard, which says that they have to share this data, obviously, without any ways for competitors to re-identify users, which is indeed very important. But we think there are ways to essentially preserve utility, at least not at the level of removing 99% of the data set. And this, we think is something to be considered in an upcoming investigation. And it is a complex issue, but one where we can certainly land on something more reasonable.
Many thanks, Cori. How do you see this problem?
So I'm really interested to talk a little bit more about how we kind of technically achieve this. And looking at the DOJ remedies, I think of a couple of things. The thing I kind of grab at is this licensing of the index, which I find superficially quite attractive. It feels like the analogy to the kind of Big Bell Labs decision in 1956, which is like, let all the patents go free. This is going to unlock a lot of innovation. But I'm acutely conscious that I'm not enough integrated in the construction of a search engine to know what it would actually mean to license that in a way that you could use. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. The thing I've been thinking about is the kind of big question is, because we have allowed this to become so monopolized for so long, obviously one search engine doesn't just provide most of search, it also is the kind of monetary basis for a whole other piece of critical web infrastructure, which is browsers and browser engines. And how do you avoid what I think of as the sort of Mozilla problem, which is, if Mozilla gets 86% of its operating profit from being the default choice in search, and if the DOJ has, for understandable reasons, decided to try and block those payments, what can you do to make sure that there is some separate piece of that we open up competition in search, we demonopolize search, but that we don't lose this absolutely vital piece of web infrastructure? There are people like Robin Burgeon, who writes a lot of really good stuff about digital infrastructure, who have been proposing things like some kind of a levy where, basically saying, well, the default is a good idea, but the problem with the default is that it doesn't actually go to maintaining critical web infrastructure. What it does, most of it just goes to bloody Apple. But actually, what if you could pool it in some way and actually create a genuine resource that recognizes the browsers and browser engines are in fact essential web infrastructure? So that's not opening up competition in search per se, but it's about how do we design a remedy that avoids certain kinds of collateral damage that we don't want to carry out. But I want to go back to the first point, which is when I read the remedies, the thing I really, in the DOJ case, the thing I most latch onto that has the most intuitive appeal is this idea of letting everybody have access to this license in some way. So I don't know. I don't know if we have time to kind of riff on what that means technically and how helpful it is, but that feels very interesting to me.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Alissa.
Yeah, happy to dig into that. I think based on the feedback loop that Aurélien described that exists in this market, I actually think I don't like to hone in on any one of these remedies because you actually need the whole package. And the DMA gives us, maybe 2 or 3 of the components when there's actually really 5 or 6 that have to work together in a mutually reinforcing way in order to open this market to new competitors. So it has some non-discrimination requirements, it has some choice requirements, it has some very minimal data sharing requirements. It's missing, frankly, the contractual prohibitions that are at the very center of the DOJ's case against Google. So, that contract between Apple and Google, for which they exchanged $20 billion, is not addressed directly by the DMA, and it, at least in the current instance, until we get a few more years in, we're not talking about structural remedies, and both of those are absolutely essential components to actually addressing this, upwards of 90% monopoly market share that Google has in this market. So I think those all need to work together. I think when we look at the data sharing, the index is important for large players that I think will be able to afford to make use of that. I think the really novel piece that we have in the remedies proposed by the Department of Justice is access to the search API and to the ads API. So there's like an oddity about this conversation where we don't talk a lot about how would any new entrant monetize this new product, and the fact that they need to be able to have an advertiser customer base basically on day one in order to be able to offer a viable product. And so I think the comprehensiveness of the data sharing remedies that are proposed by the DOJ is one of the really novel features that I hope remains in the final order. Just on the point about the browser market, I've written about this as well on Tech Policy Press. I think when we look at the amount of money available in the search market, even if it gets redistributed among multiple, different search engines that will hopefully enter and be monetizing through advertising, that there is enough there to continue to sustain competitive browser markets as well, if we consider contracts between browsers and search engines to be one way that browsers will continue to be monetized, and even the dominant way. So I think there's a lot of, I call it the web's Stockholm syndrome, where we feel like this open web in the way that we understand it today can only continue to exist through the beneficence of the current monopolist. And I think if we get a little more creative in our thinking about what these two adjacent markets will look like when we have more search competition, I think there's actually still many options to monetize and maintain a really vibrant browser market as well.
Many thanks, Alissa. I'm trying to combine a few questions which we have in the pipeline. Mainly, when we talk about new enter or challengers to the currently deeply entrenched market of horizontal search, what would be the expectation of the? I imagine there must be several different groups of challengers. Some are different ecosystems which have strong muscles, which of comparable scale, and others are primarily focused on their business activities on search engine. Obviously, there are some and many synergies, but the center of gravity is search engine services, period. And thus, there are different strategic plans in this game. So I imagine for DuckDuckGo, getting additional 1% or 2% in the global or European or US market for horizontal search would be a tremendous success. And maybe the enforcers still have some bargaining power to force Google to somehow to allocate 5% of their market to compete for the 10 second-tier companies or newcoming companies. But this will probably not satisfy stronger players who are equally interested in opening up the market for horizontal search. And ask the question, do you see the different competitors are playing in the same symphony, or everybody is playing their own kind of composition in this game?
Yeah, so I would answer in two ways. I think that obviously at DuckDuckGo we have our focus. Our focus is really privacy. We are operating in a space where we know that the dominant firm Google is never gonna play, and I know that's providing private search. That's providing also a similar way of accessing, for instance, AI tools. We have a new Duck.ai interface where you can access models like those of OpenAI, Anthropic, and Mistral without being logged in and without this data going to these firms. So that's an angle that we have. And then I would say that when it comes to new entrants, or in general how existing players also can step up, I would come back to what Alissa explained around the a remedy, and Cori, actually you'll see a remedy that is really central in the DOJ list of remedies. So the licensing of basically the search feed, that's not in the DMA, even though it's something that would really enable to, I would say, jumpstart competition, because it would bridge the gap pretty much immediately between Google and competitors when it comes to this scale advantage. The fact that they built an index over time on the basis of abusive and sometimes illegal behavior that has a scale that isn't matched.
Thank you, Cori.
I don't think I have anything to add about the different kind of competitors in the space and how they're positioning. So let me just pass on this one.
Alissa?
I think, there's a lot of news now about the quality of search as perceived by end users, like how much of the search page is occupied by things that users don't care about, including in many instances, these AI overviews. And so there's a way for entrants to differentiate, and we see that with DuckDuckGo. I'm a DuckDuckGo user. I'll reveal my own bias. That the AI overview is not automatically generated, that you don't have to be logged in, that it gives you access to multiple different LLMs in order to generate it. These are things that Google doesn't do and will likely never do because it has its own LLM, because it's vertically integrated. So I think if we open the market, there's a lot of opportunity for potential differentiation on different vectors and axes that, as we saw in the DOJ trial, have just been unable to even come into existence because of the monopolization of the distribution channels. We haven't been able to even see, or in the minds of the consumers, imagine what an alternative search experience could look like and feel like, because every new potential entrant gives up before they even start because they don't have the distribution channels. So I don't think we should let our sort of inability to imagine prevent some of these things from coming to fruition now that we have the tools that are coming into place, both with the DMA and potentially with the remedies in the US and hopefully further action from the CMA in the UK. Those things will hopefully open the floodgates for creative entrepreneurs to come in and show us what all these alternatives could look like.
Actually, can I riff on that with an analogy? So I think that's right. And maybe one of the reasons that I find this idea of opening up the license exciting is exactly that sense. Now, to again move over to a different market, we can see, as well as search being materially broken if you're just stuck there on Google wading through loads of slop, that X was finally, as the other Cori Doctorow says, materially enshittified, and so enshittified that now people have started to move over to a different service built on a completely different kind of protocol. So if you're on Blue Sky, obviously it sits on this AT protocol. And I just saw, what was it yesterday, that somebody launched a new service that is a kind of TikTok-like service that is supposed to sit on top of the protocol, and that you get to take your graph over with you. And yes, it is true that the people who run the AT protocol haven't yet managed to spin it out into the proper independent foundation that would protect what happened to Twitter from happening to it. But that's the aim. There's quite a cool initiative called Free Our Feeds that is trying to build in that direction and make sure that it is a sustainable model. And so while I'm not the right kind of person to build such a product, I would share Alyssa's view that it would be like, we're seeing it has gotten so bad now that finally it is opening up a lot of impatience and space for innovation in people. And I think this kind of idea of algorithmic pluralism, where you've got a lot of different things sitting on top of it, seems quite exciting. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Very interesting, because you put your fingers on this kind of clash between two schools of thoughts, where some say that in order to challenge the status quo, you need to come up with some normative or ethical addendum to your business model, like privacy or green or something which would add to the existing success stories. And others say that don't reinvent the wheel, and just the main thing is to repeat business model of the current gatekeepers, maybe ameliorate it slightly here and there, but there is no room for bringing privacy or environmental sustainability or whatever is as the business model, because consumers are lazy in their vast majority, and the switch is unlikely to happen. Which school of thought is more correct here?
I mean, I'm happy to offer a view. I would not confuse a business model with the way that any particular company differentiates on quality or affordances to the user, right? So on the business model side, there is a dominant business model in the last 20 years of search, which is monetizing through advertising, contextual advertising, right? Almost every search engine does that. Not all. Some of them are subscription based, which is good and fine. So that's why, like, providing access to that mechanism to monetize whatever we're showing to the user in these search results is extremely important. But that's separate from how do we differentiate on quality in these products? And I think we're at a moment where search is being revolutionized, right? There's no question. Search qua search, the dictionary definition of the term. When people go online and look for things, they are using different tools to look, and they are getting something back that is not 10 blue links. It hasn't been 10 blue links for a long time, but it's not widgets either, right? It's a narrative from a chatbot. And so again, I think the idea that of the tens, hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs out there. None of them can think of a different way of doing this from the top 5 AI companies or the number 1 search engine. Like I just don't buy it. That's not what the history of the internet and digital technologies have shown us. So I think there's going to be a lot of ways that companies can differentiate, and that might be privacy or green, or it might be, we give back to certain charities that you care about, or it might be, it might bleed into the business model conversation around when we think about the outputs of LLMs, how do we actually monetize those, which I don't think anybody has really cracked the nut on. So in that space, as long as competitors have access to the channels and the data that they need to build the business, get it off the ground, I'm very optimistic about us seeing lots of different offerings in the future, including privacy-based ones and green ones and many other ones.
Many thanks.
Unless if I can just throw off, I think it's something that Satya Nadella at Microsoft said during the trial in the US, that search is the biggest VC no-fly zone of the internet, and that's because of the market is being so close, right? And I think by I would say lifting these barriers, that would be really a massive enabler. So I think the DMA is already an enabler, is already enabling probably certainly more investment, innovation, and things that could be done than without it. And I think the idea now is really to maximize this and to go to the next stage, and after which I think my own company would certainly have lots of ideas of what to do, and same goes for others.
Many thanks. We've been mentioning on few occasions already during this conversation a pivotal landmark emblematic case, DOJ versus Google, which is currently at the stage of tailoring remedies. Can you please reflect why this case attracts so much attention? How many or what specifically is so revolutionary, particularly in the area of tailoring or designing remedies, which can somehow show the powerful, meaningful differences in the situation once the final judgment is delivered and implemented? Maybe we can start with you, Cori, this time, so that you don't.
Sure. Let me not repeat what I've already said about my interest in the index. I mean, the blindingly obvious point is that we haven't broken up a tech company in a very, 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 very long time. And so if they hold the line and they persist in a structural separation, then you're going to see a completely different internet. I mean, isn't that the basic point? But I see two cases as companion cases, I think, is the other thing I would say. Alissa keeps talking correctly about the fact that, like it or not, the business model for the non-paywalled internet is you pay for your time and with your attention and advertising. And so I think if we're really it's an incredibly important case by itself. I don't wish to understate the scale of what has already been achieved in the search and search advertising trial. But if we're really hoping to unlock the kind of second one to watch, and I think we're all waiting with absolutely bated breath for it, is actually what happens in the ad tech trial, because ultimately that is going to the heart of Google's profits, basically. But I think what has been really, I think the other big question that I've been asking myself about the remedies and about the way that it's going to go is what's going to happen in Trump 2, because this was a Trump 1 case originally, then it was amended and it was pursued through and taken through to trial, wasn't it, as I understand it, in the Biden administration. And at the moment, the indication is that the amended filing, the amended remedies suggest that they're materially holding the line on at least the indexing and on at least the default payments. But I think there are some of the other pieces that are a bit more forward-looking, for example, on artificial intelligence, that seem to have been softened, as well as on Android. So, I guess it's anybody's guess on here. Has anybody got any bets down about whether this case settles or whether it goes all the way to trial? If you're putting down $50, what do you say? My $50 is it doesn't settle, by the way.
If I can just jump in. So first of all, I think there's a lot of players involved in this case, the federal government, but also a number of states. So, there is interest. And I think what makes really this case very, fascinating and I think a landmark case is because, we've had this verdict last August. Google is a monopolist and actually has won, et cetera, et cetera. And I think with the breadth that was not achieved in previous cases, right? The Android case in the EU was one obviously of huge significance, and that also kind of found pretty similar dynamics. But this case, I think, goes further into providing evidence, clear evidence on this reinforcing feedback loop that I mentioned already, and that really makes Google's position essentially unbeatable at the scale that they achieved. You know, I would add there, just like Cori said, that it's something that was started in the Trump one, upheld under Biden, and then recently upheld again under Trump 2. And I think the evidence from the trial, from the verdict last year, is just so clear and so blunt that I think there's no going away of actually landing on a certain number of ambitious remedies from that case.
Many thanks, Alissa.
I think it's a bad time to be making predictions in general. Everything is so uncertain, but I think you know, I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and all the indications that I see, I heard Gail Slater, the head of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, speak this week, as well as the FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson. It's full steam ahead on these enforcement actions, I think, and so I'm remaining cautiously optimistic that that you know, we'll see a result here where the government continues to press. Just a couple of other aspects of the proposed remedies to call out. We spoke a little bit about browsers earlier, but the Chrome divestiture, I personally think, is an absolutely essential part of this remedy, and that's because although there are different moments in the case and in the judgment where we see different levels of credence being given to the importance of Chrome to the search monopoly, it is obvious from the behaviors in the market how critical it is and how central it is, and that essentially its reason for existence is to drive traffic to Google properties and mainly to Google search. I think perhaps the most telling data point on this is the fact that Apple tried to intervene in this case in the remedies phase. And the argument that they made was that Google was going to be so distracted dealing with the Chrome divestiture that they weren't going to give enough attention to their poor contract that they have between the two of them. And so Apple needed to intervene. So even Apple is acknowledging how central Chrome is to the search monopoly. And you can try to attack it with sort of, you know, behavioral remedies, kind of anti-self-preferencing or non-discrimination kind of provision. The web and search are so deeply intertwined that the level of oversight that would be needed in order to successfully carry that out, I think, is sort of beyond the remit of anything that we've seen as a historical precedent in one of these cases. And doing a structural separation or a divestiture is a much cleaner and potentially more effective way of eliminating that avenue for Google to be able to preference itself through the browser. So I think that piece is absolutely critical. We spoke a little bit about some of the AI provisions. It is true that one of those was walked back between the proposed remedies of the Biden administration and the final remedies proposed by the Trump administration, and that relates to forward-looking acquisition of AI companies. But there are quite a number of other AI-related provisions that remained or got strengthened. One that I will call out has to do with publishers' rights against this monopoly. So there's a provision in there that allows website publishers to opt out of having their web content crawled by Google's crawlers at the level of granularity of individual AI models. As far as I know, that is the most granular provision of its kind that has been proposed anywhere in the world, allowing you know, publishers to have a say over whether their data actually gets you know, involved or used for any of Google's products, including search or the AI models. So that, I think, is it's quite novel. And I think, as you know, we think about all the different ways contractually that Google tries to exercise its might, that's an important one to have included in any of these packages, I think, going forward.
Thank you very much. My next question, I know we are approaching the end of our conversation, is about, I know each jurisdiction is unique, but it's kind of an experimental mode where we can learn from each other, and the empirical experience is not limited to the US, EU, UK. There are many other jurisdictions, and I'm sure with your technical understanding of how digital markets function, you look periodically at some different regulatory solutions proposed and implemented, maybe even in other parts of the world. For example, in this DOJ case, people talk about technical committee, which will somehow a body which will somehow filter out who will be requesting this additional data and whether to grant this data. It sounds to me quite interesting novella. Maybe you are familiar of any other examples which can be potentially implemented, or the spirit of it, or some technicalities could be implemented in the European Union by the DMA team. So if such examples exist, maybe some jurisdictions show specific dynamic or very promising, please share with us. Aurélien?
You know, when talking about the top jurisdictions looking into such markets, I would really name there's the trial in the US, there's the CMA in the UK, and at the EU level. And so I think that's really where our focus is generally, because it's where, for the EU, rules are in place. In the UK, search and investigation is ongoing on Google's strategic market status. So this is where the focus is. I would say that we do have, ideas on how the process can be improved for the EU. Not necessarily looking at specific other models, but for instance, I think there's been some criticism with the DMA that because gatekeepers are in charge of compliance, they're able to put something on the market where competitors or third-party experts, consumer bodies, are able to sort of comment after the fact on the mere observation of what they see on the market. And so I think on the basis of that experience, there's already improvements to be made probably on the way that market testing is done. So that is, working with market players in order to improve the compliance mechanisms. And, that's why we are quite encouraged to see that the Commission is using the specification proceedings. And here, I don't need to comment on the substance of those that are ongoing, but just to say that in these proceedings, you have consultation built in, market testing built in, that in my view can lead eventually to better results.
Thanks, Cori.
I'll just be very brief. I mean, the market investigation tools, I think that you've got in Germany and in the UK, it'll be interesting to see. I'd like to see a little bit more use made of them, but also them spreading a bit farther, basically, just because they let you draw the box quite a lot wider. Very brief answer.
Can I just follow up quickly on that, because Cori, I very like the idea of the market investigation tools, but I can't help to say that we've been a bit frustrated with the way it's been used in the UK lately, and there's been a really great market investigation on mobile ecosystems, and at least when it comes to choice architecture, a lot of good things being said there, and it's gone nowhere, right? So there needs to be, mechanisms to actually make the findings a reality eventually.
Completely. And and just to agree and add with that, I mean, then there was another one, there was the kind of cloud investigation as well, right? And then at the very end of this process, having gone on for 2 or 3 years, and therefore having teed up legally what they would need to do to impose remedies, they said, oh, well, we're going to move it over to the new regime in the DMCCA, which is, as we all know, like for all intents and purposes, basically a punt. And it's a punt, I'm sorry to say it, because they have come under a huge pressure from the minister class to blunt enforcement. So I know I realize that I come to this with a slightly trenchant dose of political realism here, but I think, and I don't wish to just sit here and say it's all about posture, it's all about posture, it's all about posture, but I think, but that's one beautiful example of how whatever your statute says, if somebody goes and rug pulls for these enforcers, then they're going to be in a difficult place. So, I think, the Biden era enforcers, along with Trump 1, and we'll see with Trump 2, got what they got done, without a whole bunch of shiny new tools, right? They dug up a whole 100-year-old tools that had lain rusted in the field for a very long time. So, in a way, yeah, I'd love to see lots of legal innovation, but the other thing I would point to, just having agreed with you that it only goes so far as the willingness to use it, is there are lots of other regimes that have been let's take something like South Africa, who have drafted their competition law to encompass a whole bunch of values that if you talk to some people in slightly more technocratic competition jurisdictions at the moment, they'll look at you like you have three heads if you say that it can be helped to that it could be used to pursue greater kind of equality or something like this. So I think it genuinely is worth thinking more broadly about what the purpose of these regimes are, I think, and not just assuming that if we put a bell or a whistle on a statute that by itself is going to get us to where we want to go. I do agree with Aurélien about that, actually.
Thank you very much. Alissa?
I'm happy to pass on this. I know we're trying to wrap up.
Okay, so I think these are the main questions which I wanted to address with you. Maybe we can let me invite each of you to channel the message, the main message which you want to convey to the Commission, as we are primarily focused on the DMA do's and don'ts, and also to gatekeepers, maybe to the most relevant for this conversation. How would you put it, Aurélien?
I don't know. I have very much to say to. Oh, sorry. Did you ask for me or Aurélien? I missed that question.
I think we can start with Aurélien, but if you
No, go Aurélien. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the message to the Commission, I would also say, and to the CMA, is really to not bow in this tough political climate, which actually is probably not as tough. I think there is support from also the US on enforcing the competition rules, or at least not the resistance that we think there is. And so I think that there really is a need from the perspective of challengers that the Commission, that the CMA enforce the tools they have at their disposal.
Thank you. Cori?
I don't have any message for the gatekeepers, really, because I don't answer to kings of industry. But in terms of the enforcers, I think exactly as Aurélien said, the population of Europe are at this moment much more supportive of strong enforcement to tackle and disperse the power of the platforms and the ways in which the marketplaces have been abused than they have ever been, for all kinds of reasons. There are lots of indicators of general public opinion kind of supporting strong enforcement on the platforms, broadly speaking. Then I would say, just in a slightly more technocratic lane, to end in a lane that I don't usually sit in, I really have been encouraged by moments in which I have seen the authorities engaging with and developing new forms of analysis that seem to me to be more suited to the moment. So to give you one example, I am really encouraged when I see a greater use of financial analysis in antitrust cases in Europe, as opposed to just IO economics, so which gave us, of course, the good decision in Apple tax. I'd like to see a lot more of that. Like, let's look at what maybe it's less glamorous, but let's look at what the accounting says. And then I suppose there was quite an interesting recent paper, just for maybe the students or others who are out there, I saw recently from Fernando Castillo de la Torre, who has basically said that the law of 102 really runs the risk of being compressed, and then potentially swallowed by the so-called more economic approach. And if you haven't seen or read this paper from the most senior competition lawyer in the Commission, I would really commend it to you, because it makes the point that ultimately what we are talking about is a system of law and law enforcement, which is enforced by generalist judges. That is correct. I think it is what the moment probably calls for, and that is what the population of the European Union seem to me to want.
The dwindling law in Article 102 TFEU, I think it's called, the latest one. It's fantastic paper, absolutely. Cannot agree more. Alissa?
So to the gatekeepers, I would say the best products win when they compete on the merits. And if we saw these companies putting as much focus on making the best products that consumers love as they've put into, preventing others from entering the markets, that, we'd see it shake out through fair competition, and that's what we're supposed to see. I think to the Commission, I would say, in particular, sitting here in Washington, enforce your laws as if democracy depends on it, because it probably does. And, the fusion between technological power and public power, I think, is evident, at least in my everyday life now. So the idea that we can separate those two through the enforcement of these new laws, including the DMA, I think that is already proven false in my eyes, and strong enforcement of these will be absolutely critical to what comes next.
Absolutely, but that's not the end, because we finish our conversation with inviting each of you to provide some recommendation to those who will be shaping digital or acting in digital markets in 5, 10, 20, 50 years time, those who are current students and who would really benefit not from just, you know, box ticking advice like work harder, but something which would really resonate with their business model, so to say. Aurélien.
Yeah, I think it's you know, an important point in this world with so much information is that when you do your research, when students do their research to and are not necessarily super familiar with the landscape yet, to be careful, pay attention to so-called astroturfing, to organizations or experts that may be actually paid by the Googles of this world to say, to share a particular viewpoint, but not necessarily disclosing it. So I think it's something to keep an eye on.
Thank you very much. Cori?
Students, you are so much closer to being able to make a material difference now, however young and however junior you think that you are, than you realize. You have so much more power than you potentially realize. Lina Khan, I realize a very special person, was what, 32 when she took over the head of the Federal Trade Commission? And I'm incredibly excited that now eager students are packing out some of those antitrust courses, and I hope that we see some of that happening, at least in the legal profession elsewhere. And yes, young people can also go and make incredible new tech products, and then they go work for Aurélien or for a startup as well, because maybe we can open up the market in some other way. But I think the quote I would use is from the late lamented David Graeber, which is that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make, and we could just as easily make differently.
Thank you very much. Alissa?
I would say two things. First, coming back to an earlier point, this DMA needs as many eyes on it as we can possibly get. There's a dire need for empirical analysis of what is actually happening as a result of this regulation and other ones that are coming into force. And there's in some ways there's a short window of opportunity to compare what the world looked like before to what it looks like afterward. So, you know, find a mentor, find someone, another academic, a professor who is excited about these questions, and attach yourself to that person. The other thing I would say, coming more from a technical perspective, is we need more expertise from behavioral science, computer science, data science, engaged in antitrust and anti-monopoly. We're getting into these areas where we're talking about how do we anonymize search query logs, how should we design a choice screen, what does human behavior tell us about how consumers will react in the marketplace. We need those technical skills to be injected into this debate. I love my lawyer and economist friends, but we need more diversity of perspectives to be lent to this endeavor.
Absolutely. Cori Crider, Aurélien Mähl, Alissa Cooper, thank you very much for this really informative conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.